conference on cabins in the woods.
Live.
Yeah.
So
Welcome, everyone. Oh, go ahead, Mike.
we're live.
Wonderful. Welcome, everybody. We've been having a great conversation here, and it's wonderful to know that the rest of you are joining in now. My name's Rochelle Johnson, and I am the president of the Thoreau Society, and I'm welcoming you today on behalf of myself and Ken Lizotte, who is the president of Thoreau Farm. The Thoreau Society and the Thoreau Farm partner together to bring you the right connection, as you likely know. Our series of conversations with authors, also workshops on writing. There's no better program than today's to illustrate the vital relevance of Thoreau to our times. And it'll be my honor in just a minute to introduce you to our conversation between Michael, Frederick, and David Gessner. First, I want to let you know about our next Right Connection program. It's on March 28th at 2 p.m. featuring Peter Alden, renowned naturalist and Concord native. Peter will be speaking about birds and mammals in Concord from Henry's time to today. So with no further ado, I'll announce our conversationalists today. They're going to have a bit of a conversation. Mike Frederick probably needs no introduction to all of you. He's the executive director, lucky for us, of the Thoreau Society and has been since 2006. Mike's research interests include Thoreau's social philosophy and ethics, and also his late natural history projects. Mike did some postgraduate work as a research assistant towards the publication of Thoreau's Wild Fruits. And our special guest today is David Gessner, who's written many books on topics ranging from Teddy Roosevelt to Ed Abbey to Wallace Stegner to Osprey to the Charles River to Frisbee golf, wide-ranging.
I need to correct you. Ultimate Frisbee, not Frisbee.
Ultimate Frisbee. Oh my gosh. Oh, that really warrants correction. I know that's a serious mistake that I just made in those circles. So my apologies. His most recent book is about Thoreau in our age of crisis, and its title is Quiet Desperation, Savage Delight, Sheltering with Thoreau in the Age of Crisis. And that's a book that's just forthcoming. He claims there that Thoreau, he has claimed elsewhere, I should say, that Thoreau ruined his life. And he ruined it in good and bad ways. So I'm sure we'll hear about that. Scott Russell Sanders has described this new book as part memoir, part natural history, part travelogue, and part literary homage to Thoreau, who ruined David's life. David serves as the chair of creative writing at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. He's also the founder and editor-in-chief of Ecotone, the wonderful journal, and his writing has earned him all sorts of awards, Pushcart, John Burroughs, Asley's Creative Nonfiction Award, and others. So I am so excited to hear where this conversation goes today, and thanks so much to you both for being with the Right Connection. Turn things over to you, Mike.
Thanks, Rochelle. Welcome, David, and welcome webinar guests. It's great to have everyone here today. David, I just finished reading your book that's not out until May, Quiet Desperation, Savage Delight. And we look forward to carrying this at Walden Pond Bookstore. And really, you cover much. This is basically a memoir of your year during COVID. And I guess I'd like to start because I feel I have something in common with you, and that's, how did Thoreau ruin your life? Because once you catch the Thoreau bug, it's hard to shake it.
Thanks, Mike. This is going to be a test run today on Mike finally, after many, many years, pronouncing Henry's last name correctly, which you both have done and which I never do. And so, and you mentioned the new book, and I think it looks a little like Marley and Scrooge, him floating here. And I realized when I was getting ready that it's my second book with him on the cover, though a lot of people, like somebody came up to me and said, why do you have Abe Lincoln on the cover of your book? So the line that both Rochelle and Mike have mentioned is one of the first is actually in the first paragraph of the book. And it's a story. I moved south 18 years ago, and I can remember that handily because my daughter is about to turn 18. And we moved down here for kind of Thoreauvian reasons in terms of having a new child, our first child. I needed to support myself. Health insurance, salary seemed like a good idea. So I'd written a book that said, I will stay forever on Cape Cod, which is how I got my job in North Carolina. And during that summer, when my daughter was newborn, we went back up and we did a pilgrimage to Alden. And I had her on my shoulders, and we walked around the pond and got to the foundation, and I pointed and said, that's where the man lived who ruined Daddy's life. And, you know, as both of you said, I mean, ruined in a good way. I started reading Henry, I'll call him, as I warmed my way up into Thoreau. I started reading Henry as a sophomore in high school, and kind of all dreams of being a lawyer or a doctor or whatever slowly flew out the window. And more I thought I wanted to be a writer. So I knew, the old Robert Frost, the line they always drag out at graduation, unite your avocation and vocation. I knew that I wanted to do that by the end of high school. But then I went into college, and my skill set, I really hadn't done any writing. So I was a good cartoonist. That's part of the reason I got into college. And I was lucky enough to get into Harvard, and my editor there was Bill McKibben of climate change fame. And my big climactic moment of college was drawing a cartoon of Reagan from the back, urinating on an unemployed man in the gutter, called the trickle-down theory. And Bill came to my defense when the conservatives attacked me. And anyway, I spent my college learning discipline, daily discipline artistically, but it was drawing, not writing. And then I got out of college, and I went and played in an ultimate Frisbee, not to be confused with Frisbee golf, which is a sedentary sport for old people, whereas ultimate is a vigorous sport for young people. And I was coming back from a tournament the summer after I graduated, and I had come upon this book, which is another name I probably mispronounce. I mean, I kind of want to say Joseph Wood Crutch, but maybe it's Crouch. You guys can tell me in the chat. But it was in the house where I was renting, and I started to read it. And there are many great biographies. In fact, my book was partly born of Laura Wall's biography. But this fired me up in such a way that I decided I was going to try to write right away after college. And to write, as I know now, teaching my students, without having done any writing before that, is to set oneself up for failure. So I set right away. I was lucky enough to have the equivalent of Emerson's Emerson's Land. I had my father's Cape Cod cottage, which no one had spent the winter in. And I went there to spend the winter. And I started writing, and the book was big and clunky. And I think the characters even quoted Thoreau to each other, because even though I loved Henry, my hero image was Hemingway. I wanted to be the great American novelist. So I basically spent my 20s writing two big, bad novels. And while I was doing that, I was working as a framing carpenter and as bookstore clerk. And I didn't know it. I felt pretty much like a failure. And that's where Henry actually came in. The life that men praise and call successful is but one kind was a big line of mine in my 20s. But what I was learning really was I was learning to write, and I was learning writing habits, because though I never published anything, I was writing every day. And I'll stop here for now, but that would kick in later on once I started to have some luck finding my voice and publishing. Now, I'll just say one other thing that I was doing at the time. I mentioned, and I'll talk a little later about Thoreau influencing my writing, the creation of my writing shack behind my house. But the most obvious thing he did, and that I have from when I was 16 on, I've got about 60 of these journals at this point. So I was writing this bad, clunky fiction on the one hand, but I was writing in a different voice in here. But later on, when I finally did publish, I said, use your journal voice, use where you sound most like you. And it was an interesting mix between bad fiction and kind of honest nonfiction.
I really like the voice that you develop in your memoir, and you cover such a variety of topics. It's interesting for me to hear you refer to Thoreau as Henry, which Thoreauvians often do that, and I guess it's because they feel a close relationship to this particular writer, and maybe that's because we do get a view of his journal, so we get to see what's going on in his daily life. We can follow him.
I'm sure a lot of people do what I do when we're writing longhand and throw HDT down there.
Yeah.
Regular thing.
But like your memoir, Thoreau is an adventurer, and we see him at Cape Cod or the Maine Woods or at Walden or the Concord and Merrimack Rivers. So he's very place oriented as a writer. As working my way through your book, you're also very place oriented. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Obviously, he was a huge early influence, and later influences like Scott Russell Sanders and Wendell Berry, Annie Dillard, were equally place driven. In fact, I know this is a writing group as well, and I'd love to send along this place exercise I have where I ask people to dredge up specifics of the place they love, then write their way into it and imagine walking into it, and from there, letting that jettison them off into an essay, into what they're thinking about that place. But place has always been huge to me. But the models I had for place used, in particular Wendell Berry, used the metaphor of marriage to place. And I've traveled a great deal in Concord. They had one place that was their love, and for me, early on, it was Cape Cod. And then when I was 30, I found myself back in my actual hometown. I don't admit it, but I'm a Worcesterite, and I was back in Worcester, and I had testicular cancer. I was 29, a week shy of 30, and I had applied to grad schools finally after those 10 years of kind of in the desert of trying to write novels. And during my radiation in May in Worcester, which was quite an experience as things bloomed and I was sick inside, I got rejected one by one from writing schools. And it was at the end of May that I got accepted into the University of Colorado Boulder. And I was airlifted out of Worcester into Boulder, and just couldn't have been a bigger contrast. And that fall in the mountains in Colorado was the first time words really came to me. So I kind of had a second love now. I had Colorado and Cape Cod. And while in Colorado, I turned around and wrote a book, which actually is called A Wild Rank Place. And it's a Thoreau quote. It is a wild rank place and there is no flattery in it. It's about Cape Cod in the off season, but it's also about my blunt businessman father from Worcester, Massachusetts, who died young. And so I write this book about Cape Cod while in Colorado. It wouldn't do for a Cape Cod nature writer to be in Colorado. So I moved back to Cape Cod to promote my first book at 35. And then I write a book about loving Colorado, which is when I started to kind of define myself as a polygamist of place. If they're going to say that place is about marrying one place, I realized, I had these deep attachments to more than one place. And Cape Cod was one, Colorado mountains were one, Carolina coast has become one, and Utah, the interior of Utah has become another. And so I had to kind of separate myself from Henry and from Wendell Berry and kind of create my own identity as someone who could love place on the move.
Mm.
And in fact, this book is the first time. So, as I said, I've been down there 18 years and I've written books about the American West. I've written books about following ospreys to Cuba. This is the first book, finally, after being there 18 years, that mostly is about North Carolina. Though, of course, there's that pull back to New England, to Walden, but also to the Cape. So I'm always feeling kind of this tension between places that I love, which I think makes me like almost everyone, really. So
And as we're talking to writers today through the Right Connection program, another thing that struck me is the many different hats that you potentially wear as a writer, where when you were in college, you came up with a plan to illustrate the Ronald Reagan piece, Trickle Down Economics, and that became sort of a vision for you that would actually develops over time, and it came back even recently in a thread on Facebook. And so here you are.
The yellow vests, the revolutionary group in France, have used it as their motto: rich people pissing on poor people.
So you have sort of the practice of being an illustrator, being a writer, and also you're a major, for a writer, you're a major Facebook presence, I would say. So you're on social media, and your relationship with social media is mixed in terms of the attitude you expressed about social media in your book. Would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Well, I think the word, as you know, I'm teaching a class this term called writing time. And the idea was, you know what, everyone's so burnt out. We're all so fried at this point. I wanted to give my graduate school students and my undergrads a little safe spot where they could just write. And so what I do is I gather them once on Zoom and once in person each week to just write. And I give them a talk about it. And the word I say again and again is momentum. The creation of momentum. Everyone talks to me and says, oh, you're so prolific, you write so much. Well, first of all, I have the luxury of failure. Remember those 15 years before I published the first book, and kind of got the habits in place. And once things started cooking, I like to work on multiple burners, right? And that could be social media partly, but most of it is different book projects or journalism projects. So I actually have had a couple professors from my program who started to come to my writing time class, one of whom was having a very hard time writing during the pandemic and feeling oppressed and feeling, how can I write during this? Well, for me, I flip that around and say, this is my refuge. That time I'm an early morning writer. One doesn't have to be, but I write every day from like 6 to 9, 6 to 10. Carving out that time gives me a period that's safe from those other things, where I digest those other things. And so, I say to them, just try for 1 week to write every day. Not a lot. Isaac Dinesen said, write a little every day without hope or despair. Maybe keep track of how much time you write, even if it's 20 minutes. And one thing you'll start to find is you have a bad day, you have an okay day, you have a good day, maybe you start to have momentum. And one of the professors who came to the class is on day 31 now and is feeling really, I feel like a self-help guru, like Tony Robbins, not a writer or something now, or Wim Hof for those who know him. And, and it's really become kind of a sub-interest of mine. Obviously I'm concerned with environmental issues, with writing, with fiction, but I'm also concerned with kind of what William James said, how do we release our creative energies? How do we do that best? And there are a lot of ways you can do that. Like for some people, it's being monomaniacal and focused on one thing. For some, it's jumping between things, using kind of the old Churchill, a change is as good as a rest line. And I'm fascinated by it because, I've had to do it while being chair and being a dad and being other things. So I regard those 3 hours in the morning almost religiously. So the Facebook stuff is just fumes after that. It's kind of just because I'm a social person and it's fun to be in touch with my grade school friends and my high school friends. But the real core of the writing, the daily ritual, is that 3-hour block.
I enjoyed learning, David, that out of Bob Richardson's his 3 biographies, on one on Emerson and one on Thoreau and one on William James, that you really appreciated the biography on James. Which
I love it.
Yeah.
I love all 3 of his, and that was a great loss for us during the year. There were so many people who died in the past year. Edmund Morris, the great biographer of Roosevelt,
Yeah.
Bob
Thoreau
Richardson.
is the first example in his varieties of religious experiences. He quotes
Yeah.
from Alden.
But another example, which is fascinating to me, a whole other world of mine. I'm interested in Western history. So Bernard DeVoto, in The Year of Decision, has like 6 archetypal figures in 1846. What year was it? 1840. Well, I have it up on the 1840s, and they're all like big political figures. And then he suddenly cuts to Walden Pond, and it's just like this kind of counter-American narrative, right? As we all know in this group, you have the story we told, the Manifest Destiny story. It's kind of funny to swing for me from Teddy Roosevelt to Thoreau, right? And then we have the counter-narrative, and the counter-narrative that, for the most part, the mass of people have turned against, but some of us still cling to it.
Yeah. Well, I'm not giving too much away to say that the book is divided into sections where you're actually writing down at the opening of each of these sections the confirmed number of deaths due to COVID. So we're very aware throughout the book that you're sort of working through a year of COVID. One of the sections in the book that I really enjoyed reading was here, and I think if we're going to focus on a particular event in the book, this might be it. But you talk about flying in with Bruce Gordon into the Yak Valley and learning about the grizzly bears, and particularly the grizzly bears in that area of the world live principally on blueberries, I think you said, or on berries.
Yeah.
Did you talk about the Yak Valley
Like
experience there?
Sure. And I'll do a quick, Mike, unless I'm wrecking your question order, I'll do a super quick outline up to that chapter so people get a sense of,
Sure.
Or is that something you got coming up that you want to get to?
No, go for it.
So basically what happened with this book, one thing that Thoreau knew and any writer knows is just how damn commercial big publishing is. And when I did play Ultimate Frisbee, I played with the Boston team called Titanic, which was the second best team in the country. And we would train all year and then I'd quit and play with a goofy team. Like we had a team called the Popes the next year, or the Whistle Pigs or something. And really that's where I've evolved to in my writing life too. The Theodore Roosevelt book was with Simon and Schuster, all the whistles and bells. But one of the things with big publishers is you can't fully be yourself, right? I mean, that's what Henry taught us more than anything. So while I was preparing for this book to come out, and it was originally supposed to come out early in the pandemic, and of course they pushed it off, other interests started intruding. And this was in January and February of last year. I started reading a book that I'm sure many of you read, Laura Wall's biography, which I loved. And I also started rebuilding my writing shack. I have a little, to call it property is an exaggeration, but I'm on a little peninsula on Hewlett's Creek, which is also known as Dawson's Creek, where I have my kayaks and I can go out and paddle out to a barrier island. And in the corner, illegally, I've built a little cabin. Who do you think inspired that, And during Florence, it had 8 feet of water in it, and it was entirely wiped out. There's my daughter saying goodbye. She's going running, and she's the one who I brought at Walden Pond. So the shack gets wiped out. So during last year, January and February, I'm reading Walden. I'm reading the biography. I'm reading Walden. I'm rebuilding the shack, and I built an Osprey platform out on the marsh. So I say in the book, it was like I was studying for a test that I didn't know was coming, like I was cheating. So I was pretty ready to reside in place and to be away from the world. And I had it all set up. And so the first chapters are kind of about that and about keeping journals. And then the next chapter is, I'm sure many of you had this experience. I lived in Boulder for a long time, and looking at the scenes of rewilding that were happening suddenly all over the world once the world shut down. And the archetypal one for me was seeing the mountain lions walk down the main street of Boulder in the snow. And that thrilled me. And I'm not going to go off on that. Well, it kind of fits in with the grizzlies. I'll get there. And what happened was I just wrote, as the title of this is, On the Heels of Experience, as things were happening, and kind of used that momentum and kept kind of a semi-journal and followed the year around. And weirdly, suddenly we had Black Lives Matters protests, and my daughter was involved in those, and I was talking about Thoreau and Martin Luther King, and and the year just followed. And one of the fascinating things I thought about Henry's life that was true of our lives that year is it was both removed and never so connected politically as I'd ever been before. Like what Trump did every day or what was on the news seemed to impact my life. At the same time, I was living this kind of life more in nature. So it's a very strange year. But finally, to get to your question, Mike, it's really kind of a past tense reflection because it had happened the year before. But as I finished the Teddy Roosevelt book, I hooked up with this guy, Bruce Gordon, who has a little plane that's called EcoFlight, and he takes people over land that they hope to save in the West. And I wrote to him and said, do you have any trips where I could hitch a ride? And sure enough, he said, yeah, come on out. I came out, we flew out of Aspen through Colorado. We banked around the Tetons, which was amazing. I mean, I felt like we were going to hit them. We were so close. We stopped for gas in Missoula and we went up to the Yak Valley. And there, I'm sure some people on this have read Rick Bass's work. There we met with Rick Bass, who was trying to save a remnant population of grizzlies in northern Montana. But it was the way he lived, which was, Thoreau squared, basically, out in the middle of nowhere in Montana that just excited me. And Hadley, who just left, is a vegan. And her mother, Nina, is a novelist. And we have been kind of appalled that Hadley doesn't read for pleasure. So I made a deal with Hadley at the time that said, for every day you read 20 minutes, I'll be a vegan the next day. And I was going on 2 months when I got to Rick Bass's house in northern Montana. And he was having a meeting of this group to save the grizzlies. And he said, can you grill? And I said, sure. And he handed me an antelope leg on a platter. And I knew my days as a vegan were over. So I spent a wild time up there where I thought a lot about how, the remnant animals, just like the remnant wild, just we're kind of being stamped out, and how my own life, what I'd chosen, was a kind of domesticated wild, and I felt a little like not accused, but like I wanted to match the wildness I found there. And so a lot of the rest of the book is me trying to kind of find domestic wildness at home, which is also what my Green Manifesto about the Charles River is really about, the limited wild.
Did you have formidable experiences in nature that you might point to that helped you make the career path that you ultimately chose? I mean, I can think just for myself, going out to the Tetons and going out to see the Grand Canyon, Zion, Bryce. I did that trip in 1993, 92. And coming back from it and I was working on State Street in Boston. I had a job in finance, and a couple of things came together that just shifted me away from that and into wanting to study the natural world, study Thoreau.
Yeah.
Anything like that for you?
Yeah, let me first answer Katie's question, which is really relevant to kind of what I was saying in terms of trying to develop my own voice in my 20s, where I kind of had a split thing going on where I was writing, Jonathan dove into the pool and exclaimed, the pool is cold. And then in my journal, I was writing, the trees, those leaves on the post oak are waxy and fluctuating. I need to get out here more, and slowly started to realize that the journal voice was going to be the voice that won out. And what I really tried to do, I even call it the Thoreau method to my students, because of course we imagine him out there walking and seeing, light shafting down and scribbling it down on a piece of paper, using the family pencil, no doubt, sticking it in his pocket, then writing that into the journal. That's another draft, right? Then taking that out of the journal to be a speech. So it's very oral and voice driven, and then, into a book. So what I'd started to do was, I think, yeah, I have them over here. For years, I used these guys, micro cassette recorders. Now I just use the phone because there's a good app on there. But for years, what I tried to do while I was walking was actually approximate my voice, what I sound like. And I started to hear, and this is what I'd say to you as writers, is starting to hear what you sound like. I tend to go from circumlocuitous, long sentences to blunt ones, and that's what I started to hear on this. So my method was to record onto here and then put it into either a journal or into my computer, and that would be another draft. And I'll say, at one point, I was living on Cape Cod in this beautiful place where I said I have everything I love and everything I hate within 1 square mile, because there was a trophy house above. And I was walking one morning and I started to write in the second person a letter to the trophy house guy. And I wrote the whole essay into the tape recorder. Not bragging, just like it was voice driven, so that's related to Katie's. As far as that goes, I would say the biggest, as far as your question, Mike, I'd say the biggest moment was I mentioned getting into Colorado. Well, that summer was a miserable one in Worcester. My dad gave me a used Buick of his that was unregistered and said, well, you might as well not register it for until you get out to a new state, to Colorado. I drove west. I will admit I'm sorry, it's bad. I was sipping beer on the way. I covered most of the trip in 2 days. And the morning when I saw the Rockies, newly recovered from cancer, I started bawling. And one of the themes of the Teddy Roosevelt book is him going out to the Badlands after his wife and mother died on the same day. And that cliche is more than a cliche of kind of renewal in the West. And it really was, that was an amazing fall I had. I started to really write and I got in great shape. I have a line in my first book, if I'm going to die, I'm going to die in the best shape possible. And so I think, and I had a new set of friends. And so the West really lifted me up in a crucial moment in my life.
That's sort of also what I was getting at is, I know, your upcoming publication, Quiet Desperation, Savage Delight, this book, but also before we met today, you sent me some of your other works, which include this one that explores Stegner and Abbey, and of course, this one on TR.
Mhm.
And so, each one of these writers also has a formidable experience in visiting the American West. And, you talk about Abbey as being really, he's an Easterner and he goes West and he becomes, he becomes associated with that.
Yeah.
Would you like to talk a little bit about Stegner and
Yeah.
Abbey?
Well, let me just say one thing, because, I mentioned moving from coast to coast and kind of being in transit. Like, one of the reasons I wrote Return of the Osprey was about the nesting season of the birds. And then when I moved to North Carolina, I decided I'm going to do the migratory season. But as far as Stegner goes, what I really felt like as a reader of all this kind of work, Stegner was kind of my gateway drug into Wendell Berry, basically, and who was his student. And I started to think about these things, but not quite so romantically, actually in a very Thoreauvian way, as the latter Thoreau, right, is starting to study and learn the phenology of the place and when things bud. And as everybody here knows, they're using that now in climate change calculations. So with Stegner, it was suddenly thinking about aridity, thinking about, how, like, what did it mean that the American West was a desert? What did it mean as far as fires? So I had this kind of new way of thinking. So when I moved back to Cape Cod, I suddenly wasn't just thinking of it as this kind of romantic place, but I was thinking about the sandy soil. I was thinking about the pulsations of tourism, and so I think for me, Stegner, I mean, I love, and Abby would be just crucified right now on social media in terms of his political incorrectness, and though I do feel in a way he's the most clearly Thoreauvian, he modernized that thing, whereas Thoreau is, attacking a woodchuck or a muskrat, and Abby's throwing a rock at a rabbit, right? And they both have that wonderful, almost Monty Python-like ability to go from the high philosophical to the stepping in dog shit humor, this brilliant kind of combo that I love. But Stegner, so Abby reminded me that you can take those things that were happening in the 1840s and 1850s, or 1850s, and they're relevant now. But Stegner was just so smart, and so I've always tried in a very, looking up at him as much more as superior to me, I've tried to use those lessons to think hard about the places where I've lived. And I really do. One of the things about the Polygamous of Place, I really feel like we can bring the tools with us. We can, like when I move to a new place, I bird watch, I kayak, I do these, these things that allow me to get to know the place. Kind of half answered your question. I'm sorry.
Well, that's great. I mean, partly it's about a community of writers, and it's saying something, I think, too, about the to classify things, but the American nature writing genre, which is unique to the United States, I would say, and has its roots with Susan Fenimore Cooper, Emerson, Thoreau, and as a writer, you're participating in this within this tradition, which I think is great. And then you do tribute to writers in your work, as well as mentioning some of the contemporary writers like Drew Lanham, who you developed a friendship with, and you mentioned Robin Kimmerer, who wrote Braiding Sweetgrass.
What a great book. What great books those both are. I mean, Drew's Home Place is fantastic, And basically, for those who don't know his work, he's basically taking the tradition of Walden and as an African-American man and kind of revamping it for the present. And Drew and I met through Orion magazine, which is also part of that tradition you described. And an interesting thing, with perhaps the exception of Emerson, who was vastly popular, right? It tends to be, like Thoreau, a less well-known tradition. Like to my mind, I read Philip Roth and John Updike as a kid, but to my mind, Wendell Berry is a greater writer. Wallace Stegner is a greater writer. And it's not recognized. Sometimes it's recognized posthumously, but it's not recognized. This thread that you described accurately, I think, is this vital American thread, is not only there, but it's being revised. When I wrote Sick of Nature in the early, 2003, I said, right now there are more Black players in the NHL than there are Black nature writers in the National Nature Writing League. And Drew and Camille Dungy and others have broken that open. And it's been really great to see what's happened to the genre. That, traditionally I complained that Cape Cod was all white guys from Harvard, and writers I love, Bob Finch, John Hay, Henry Beston, that other Henry too.
So maybe we could talk a little bit, as we're addressing a group of writers today, just in writing more broadly, even outside of the nature genre. Presumably as a writing teacher, you've taught classes in fiction and other forms of writing. Would you like to say something about that for our folks at the Right Connection?
Yeah, I'm going to look at that cheat sheet I gave you the other day, which is, I tried to put everything I knew about writing on one page, and Mike can send it to you if you like. But the first thing I saw, is a question that when I'm stuck, I always ask, which is, what am I excited about? Too often, particularly if you're working on a long project where the next thing you kind of get in lockstep and you feel your creativity deadening. Sometimes to break myself out of that, I just say, what do I feel like doing? Like strangely, rebelling against the shoulds is a freer of energy. Again, William James, like, how do we free that energy? Another thing I have on here from back saying that I worked as a carpenter while I was trying to write those first novels is I started to realize that framing drafts go up really fast. Like you frame a house, boy, there's nothing, and then it's there. But then the next year you're doing the finish work. So it's a little like Ed Lamott's famous shitty first drafts. To put that first draft up and to do it fast. I mean, that's one of the things that about this particular book. Obviously, I wrote it fairly quickly since the last chapter is in February of this year and it's coming out in June. But there's a momentum to slamming something out and not being a perfectionist. Now, the interesting thing about that is it can be self-corrective. You do that, you slam it out, and suddenly the next time you're not quite slamming so much. You're slamming and adjusting, and you're basically getting your 10,000 hours in, and you're starting to like kind of get a better feel for it. Let me just say one thing, a little off topic about this book. So I kind of knew that, I knew I wanted it to be right on the heels of the pandemic. I knew I wanted to get it out fast. And I knew I just had this Teddy Roosevelt book out in the fall. And I was pretty sure Simon & Schuster wasn't going to bite on this. So when I went to Torrey House Press, which is a press I greatly admire, they created the pamphlet that was headed out to Congress about Bears Ears that led to Obama declaring Bears Ears National Monument in Utah. And I was lucky enough to contribute to that pamphlet. So I knew I liked and wanted to work with them. But I also knew I wanted it to come out fast. And I didn't really care about money and how much they gave me, but I cared about it. And the publisher said, how about we put it out in September? And then I kind of channeled my blunt businessman father from Worcester, didn't say anything. I just waited. And she said, well, how about May? We could probably get it out in May. I was like, that's what I want. So this is kind of an experiment in moving. So, usually it takes a couple of years and moving quickly from writing to publication. So that's another thing I would say is that, to experiment with your own kind of speed. Samuel Johnson said that was a great test, just to write and write fast and see what you come up with. And one of the amazing things to me is how we always kind of sound like ourselves. I've lost stuff on the computer and rewritten it and then refound it. And it's pretty close because, and that, the whole know thyself thing is really one of the drivers for your writing. You're just trying to figure out what that self is and what that self sounds like. And in our subject today, we have the great, the great example of somebody who said, I will sound like me. My great skill set is being exactly like Henry, and I'm going to stand on that. And that to me is, that's what thrilled me as a sophomore in high school, and that's what thrills me today. All right, we got a question from David. Ah, yes. Yeah, exactly. So I can only say amen to what you said, David. That's a lot of what the book's about, is that I had already gotten to know my new home here in North Carolina pretty well. But suddenly I would paddle out to Masonboro Island and have 8 miles of beach to myself. I would have, we are one of the airplane routes, and there were no airplanes overhead. And it was, I don't want to in any way detract or from anyone's pain. And I had losses too during the year, but it really did reground me. And, one of the things I say in the book is this is a good rough draft for larger crises to come. This is a good, the same tools that you could learn from this if you chose are tools that apply to the climate crisis as well. And we're not, it's not like, hey, we're done with the pandemic. Now everything's peachy keen and we're back to normal. I think thinking people know we've got some rough waters ahead, and what you're describing and what I experienced is going to come in handy. Yes, exactly, Robert. That we are kind of fingers crossed, bears ears. We're kind of fingers crossed that is will change now with our new Secretary of the Interior, going from kind of the worst Secretary of the Interior to a Native American Secretary of the Interior. But yes, the original plan was it to be Native run, and it did not. That did not happen in the final Obama declaration. And it was really, a big part of this for me was I was writing about Teddy Roosevelt, who talk about, the cancel culture was licking its chops on that one, and they should, because if we give Roosevelt credit for being prescient about environmental issues, he also deserves to be criticized for his belief in manifest destiny 50 years after the term was invented, and for his treatment of Native Americans. So it was an interesting book because it ended up being a lot about current Native American politics and trying to mesh that with Roosevelt's original vision, which I still believe is a great vision of conservation, but it needs to be revised, right? And what better than bear's ears and new inclusive ways of treating nature to revise that brilliant original vision of saving land. Which, somebody commented about Muir, which, Muir and Roosevelt and their camping trip, and Muir has Emerson's book on his bedside, and apparently Muir brought Thoreau up to Alaska with him, if I'm reading this correctly. So so nature writers, we've done some good stuff, even though that's why that book is called Sick of Nature, by the way. That first book I wrote about my dad, I was like, this is a powerful memoir about a young father's death. And they called me a nature writer. And then I wrote a book about Colorado and regions, and they called me a nature writer. So the third book was like, screw you, sick of nature. Not that I didn't like nature, I just didn't like being called a nature writer. Sorry. Negating. I'm a little confused by that one, Robert, but the original plan was for the 5 tribes, which was Hopi, Zuni, Ute Mountain Ute, and Navajo, the real drivers. They were going to have a seat on with BLM or whatever group. They were going to have a seat in kind of running bear's ears, yes, and that did not come to pass. There was a lot of disappointment among the tribes.
There's a question in here about writing fast, and I know, just having read your book and the number of journals that you've kept over the years, in your entire life, is sort of the slow. Go ahead and answer it, but that's sort of the slow process, is keeping a regular journal. Sure. And then when you get into the fast process, so maybe you want to talk about answer that question.
Well, weirdly, they complement each other, where those years of kind of pecking out those first couple novels, they got me to keep my butt in the chair, for one thing. And they gradually got me to comfortable with my own voice. And so the fast part is trusting my voice. And that might even be talking it into the tape recorder. And, as a very voice-driven writer, to know that to know that that's what I want to do. I want to sound like me. So that's the fast part. Now, these books, like the Roosevelt book, well, fast after 2.5 years of studying and reading everything and interviewing people. And the real model for that, I don't want to lose this thought I had earlier about that, but the real change for me came with a book called Return of the Osprey on Cape Cod. And it was the first time I was offered money by a publisher, Algonquin Press, for an advance. And I quit my job. I was working as a carpenter at the time. I quit my job. And I, in March, watched the Ospreys come back from, from South America at 5 different locations, took notes, sat slowly writing in my journal, looking through a telescope, learning everything, meeting with Alan Poole, who I call my Osprey Obi-Wan Kenobi, gathering. And I had these larger journals for the Osprey because I was doing drawings too, gathering, and knowing I really couldn't start the book until the Ospreys headed south in September. When they headed south, it was like a starting gun going off because it had been building up. So it was like this restraint, and boom, I swear I wrote the draft of that book in 3 weeks, not doing a lot of sleeping. So that's kind of when I started to adopt that model, what I call, now, of course, I went back and revised it for many months after that. But the framing draft, the gist of it came pouring out. But I'm sure it had to do with the previous restraint, So it's like, how do you get your voice onto the page? And the speaking part was kind of cutting to the chase. All right, I'll just use my voice sometimes, So, but journals also. So they're slow and fast. Yeah, the hope thing's the hope thing for me is something I wrestle with a lot, and also the question of how necessary it is to have it or not have it to kind of continue onward. One thing I wrote about a lot in my Green Manifesto, the Charles River book, and this was a long time before the current criticism of doomsayers in climate, was how, to me, climate felt like the intellectual equivalent of a panic attack. And I'd pull into like kind of a mental fetal position about it, and it would paralyze me. So I started to loosen up, just like you would with writing, by starting with smaller fights. And the Charles River was an example of that. Dan Driscoll, who was my kind of the character, who was an old Ultimate Frisbee friend who we called Danimal, but who also was the one who had helped green the Charles through the bike paths and putting in native plantings. He said to me early on that we're all hypocrites. Environmentalists get down on themselves because they drive cars or fly, but we're all hypocrites, and we need more hypocrites who fight. So that was my kind of idea of limited nature and limited environmentalism. And that freed me up a little bit. And I find just like the 3 hours in the morning for writing are a block off from the world, even though they're about the world, they're a block off from the world of my personal problems. I also can block off our eventual doom during that time. Not that I don't confront it in my writing, but it doesn't stop me from writing.
There has been a shift over the years between what we used to call deep ecology and like what you're talking about, and leave it as it is. That the pendulum has shifted so far that there's now good reason to sort of leave some portions of land untouched.
And that kind of circles us back. I mean, I mentioned that Bill McKibben was my editor. I must say, when End of Nature came out in the late 80s, well before Al Gore did his thing, I was resistant to it. I didn't like the idea that I'd be hiking in the Rockies, and that was connected to the human world. This is before we started to think, anthropocentric, everywhere, the Anthropocene. And so, I've come around to being a climate activist to some degree, but I also don't want to put aside old school. That's one of the reasons I did the Teddy Roosevelt book, old school save land. And an example I use in the book is, for instance, the Y2Y initiative, Yellowstone to Yukon, where environmentalists have created a pathway for migration for big carnivores that includes going over highways on vegetated overpasses and under and vegetated underpasses. And to me, that's like still the old school Thoreauvian, but also Rooseveltian vision made new again. And I also think the thing about that is climate is such a hard rallying, it's hard to rally around. And so I think we can still fight those fights for wildness and for place, as well as the climate fight.
Yeah, well, we're coming up on our hour. If there are additional questions in chat that you'd like to answer,
I'm totally with David's last comment. That's what I've tried to do in my work is, one of the things is, you mentioned I combine autobiography with this stuff. I'm not writing, here are the environment, I'm not writing like the uninhabitable earth, for instance. I'm writing stories that have fun meetings, me and Rick Bass, me and Grizzly Bears, adventures where I'm kind of holding myself at arm's length as a character. And hopefully we're having some laughs and some joy, but we're also aware of the larger fight that we're involved in. So I completely agree that, the whole, it's a messy, human, sloppy attempt to reach back to that original. So many of the things Thoreau said are exactly what we're still fighting for. He was a good companion in the last year because it was, it could have been 1850, right? It could have been, we're still fighting for that on a larger scale despite the pressures of climate. And one of the big changes for me in terms of climate was my students who have acute anxiety, similar to what I had about nuclear war when I was young, about climate, and my daughter, who is the head of the climate, the sunrise groups at our local high school. So I've watched them, and they're better activists than me. And but yeah, I definitely try not to have it be just, this is what you should do. Because, I know exactly what I do when somebody says this is what you should do. I go in the other direction. Yeah, and save land is important too in kind of a Noah's Ark sort of way, right? If we can preserve it, we hand it down to people who maybe are smarter than us, who can do something with it in the future. No, that wasn't me. Sounds, I don't know. But I did get to know Doug Peacock out there. That was exciting because for people who, Doug Peacock, is Hayduke from the Monkey Ranch Gang. And it was pretty cool to meet him. And my daughter was obsessed with wolves at the time. And he showed her his bear skulls. So that was fun. Well, I hope this made some sense. For me, the communing with those who came before, which is a whole nother thing, we're supposed to be canceling those folks. But for me, historical empathy and reaching back to those who from earlier times is incredibly helpful in living my life day to day. My great professor in college, Walter Jackson Bate, who was a biographer of Samuel Johnson and John Keats, always talked about biography being so important because we can put it to use. How we can take it off the shelf and use it in our own life. And to me, that's the most exciting thing about biography is, hey, maybe this is going to influence how I live now, this book that was written, 175 years ago. I tried to say something appropriately conclusive and profound there, Mike. So a wrap up sort of thing.
Yes, well, thank you so much, David, for joining us. It's been a great pleasure to read your book, to meet you, to have you here with us today at The Right Connection. And just as a reminder to our audience, the book that we talked about today is coming out in May. It's
June 1st, they just moved it because of COVID reasons, but so that's close enough.
And I will say there's much in here that we didn't cover today. If you're looking for stuff on Black Lives Matter, on ecology, on species extinction, on drones, it's in here. And it's a provocative work. And the other ones that we discussed, All That Remains, and this is a New York Times bestseller. So check that book out. And the one on TR, also a New York Times bestseller. And it's blurbed by Robert Redford. So if you don't take my word for it, you can take Robert Redford's. Thanks so much, David. We hope to have you back for a future event.
Yeah, I'd love to. Maybe one day outside. We'll be outdoors and doing something.
That'll be great.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Take care.
See you soon.